Today we're going to focus on ecosystems and the biosphere, which are foundation concepts for environmental science. An ecosystem is all living organisms in an area as well as the non-living components. That includes water, soil, and air. The biosphere is the sum of all of those ecosystems on Earth. Basically, anywhere life exists. This chapter, we're going to understand how energy and matter move through those ecosystems and why biodiversity matters and how human actions affect natural systems. In this chapter, we'll cover nutrient cycles, including water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, ecosystem structure and function, biodiversity and ecosystem services, energy flow through the food web, and finally, 8 major biomes. Starting with the water cycle, water continuously flows through the environment. It evaporates from the oceans, lakes, and even the soil into the atmosphere. It condenses in the clouds, and then it falls back to Earth as precipitation. Once precipitation reaches the ground, it can run off into rivers and lakes. It can infiltrate into the soil, which means it actually the soil soaks it up. It can be taken up by plants, or it can evaporate back into the atmosphere. Water is essential for life, and this cycle helps regulate climate, weather, and ecosystem productivity. A good example of human impact on the water cycle is urbanization. Paved surfaces prevent that infiltration from happening, and it increases runoff and flooding. This is why cities are now investing in green infrastructure like rain gardens and permeable pavement. Next is the carbon cycle. Carbon moves between the atmosphere, living organisms, oceans, and the Earth's crust. Plants take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis and convert it into organic matter. Animals obtain that carbon by eating plants or other animals who also eat those plants. Carbon returns to the atmosphere through respiration. So when we breathe out carbon dioxide. It returns through decomposition. So as things die, they release carbon, and combustion of fossil fuels. Carbon can also be stored long-term in ocean sediments and rocks. The key issue today is that human activity, especially burning fossil fuels and deforestation, are releasing carbon faster than the ecosystems can absorb it. This excess carbon dioxide contributes to climate change. Nitrogen is critical for life because it's a major component of proteins and DNA. Although nitrogen makes up about 78% of the atmosphere, most organisms can't use it in the gas form. This is where nitrogen-fixing bacteria come in. These bacteria convert nitrogen gas into forms plants can use, like ammonia and nitrates. Some live freely in the soil, while others live in the root nodules of legumes, such as beans and peas. Human activity, especially fertilizer use and fossil fuel combustion, have dramatically altered the nitrogen cycle. Too much usable nitrogen can lead to water pollution, algae blooms like we've seen here in Florida, and dead zones like we've seen up in Apalachicola Bay. The phosphorus cycle is different from carbon and nitrogen because it doesn't have a gas phase. Phosphorus moves through rocks, soils, water, and living organisms. Weathering releases phosphate into soil and water. Plants absorb it, animals consume plants, and decomposition returns it to the soil. Excess phosphorus from fertilizers and sewage can cause eutrophication. This leads to algae blooms followed by oxygen depletion when algae die and decompose. These low oxygen areas are called dead zones. There's over 400 worldwide, including a large one in the Gulf of Mexico. This is that Apalachicola Bay area that I told you about. And this directly affects fisheries and coastal ecosystems, including the oyster industry here in Florida. Sulfur enters the ecosystem through weathering of rocks, volcanic eruptions, decomposition, and fossil fuel combustion. Plants absorb sulfur as sulfate and use it to make proteins. Animals obtain sulfur through their diet. When sulfur dioxide is released into the atmosphere from burning coal or oil, it can form acid rain, which damages forests, soils, and aquatic systems. Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. It exists at three different levels, and each plays an important role in keeping that ecosystem healthy and stable. Our first is genetic diversity. This is the variation within a species. Individuals of the same species aren't exactly the same. These differences help populations survive change, such as disease, drought, and temperature shifts. Some examples of these are different plant species that are more resistant to pests or heat, allowing that species to survive in a variety of different conditions and ranges. Next, we have species diversity. This refers to the number of different species in an ecosystem. Each species has a role, such as being a predator, pollinator, or decomposer. Ecosystems with more species are usually more stable and more productive. Examples of this include a forest with many types of plants and insects, birds, mammals. These forests tend to be healthier than ones dominated by only a few species. Finally, we have ecosystem diversity. This is the diversity in a variety of different ecosystems in a specific region. This can include a combination of forests, wetlands, grasslands, rivers, oceans, deserts. Different ecosystems support different forms of life and different processes. So, a region with wetlands, forests, and rivers supports more biodiversity than a region with only one habitat type. Resilience is an ecosystem's ability to withstand disturbances and recover from change, such as storms, fires, droughts, or even human impacts. Biodiversity increases resilience in a couple of different ways. Different species do different jobs. So, if one species is falling a little short, another species can take over its role and keep the ecosystem functioning. Some species survive when others don't. So, when conditions change, certain species are better adapted at surviving, so they live on, helping that ecosystem to recover. That genetic diversity we talked about earlier, that can help allow for adaptations, specifically within a species. Some individuals may be resistant to disease or tolerate new conditions better than others, and those members of the species will survive while some of the other ones might die off. And more connections make ecosystems stronger. Diverse ecosystems have many food web connections, so if one connection breaks, those other ones are going to remain. So why does biodiversity matter to humans? A lot of it has to do with health, but biodiverse ecosystems provide a lot of ecosystem services which benefit humans. One of these is provisioning services, such as food, fresh water, and medicine. A lot of plants have components that we use in different medicines. Regulating services, so climate regulation, making sure that our climate stays pretty stable. Pollination for food, and flood control. Also, cultural services such as recreation, tourism, and spiritual and cultural values. And different supporting services, so things that aren't necessarily directly involved in supporting us, but can help with different processes that we rely on. So, soil formation and nutrient cycling, those are examples. We often take these for granted until those ecosystems are damaged or biodiversity is lost. Energy is what powers life in an ecosystem. Unlike matter, which cycles, energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction, and eventually it gets lost as heat. Energy starts with producers. Energy enters the ecosystem through these producers called autotrophs. Producers include plants, algae, and some bacteria. They use the sunlight through photosynthesis or chemical energy through chemosynthesis to make their own food. This stored energy becomes the foundation for other organisms within that ecosystem. Without the producers, energy could not exist or enter the food web in any way, and that whole ecosystem would collapse. Food chains are a simple way of viewing the flow of energy. They kind of show a linear pathway. They're not exactly realistic in the larger scope, but it can be a good way of showing the flow from producer to primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. Each of those steps is called a trophic level. Examples of food chain include grass that photosynthesizes. A rabbit eats that grass. That would be our primary consumer. And then a snake eats that rabbit. That would be our secondary consumer. And finally, a hawk comes down and eats that snake. This would be our tertiary consumer. These are useful for understanding basic relationships, but like I mentioned before, they oversimplify the process. Most organisms are going to eat more than one type of food, and they're going to be eaten by more than one type of predator. Food webs show the complex network of food relationships in an ecosystem, and they're a more realistic representation of what's going on. They connect multiple food chains together. Those organisms often occupy more than one trophic level. So food webs, they definitely better present how energy flows through that ecosystem. Because food webs have multiple connections, they generally make the ecosystems more stable than a single food chain. So if one species is removed, there's other species around to provide those energy pathways. Now, as energy moves through these trophic levels, only about 10% of that energy is transferred from one level to the next. The remaining 90% is lost as heat, movement, metabolism, growth, and waste. This loss of energy follows the law of thermodynamics. So, for example, producers capture 10,000 units of energy. The primary consumer only receives 1,000 units. The secondary consumer receives 100 units, and that tertiary consumer only receives 10 units of that energy. So why does this 10% rule matter? Food chains are short. Because so much energy is lost at each step, there's not enough energy to support many trophic levels. Most food chains are limited to 3 to 5 levels. Energy just runs out after that. Apex predators are very few in number, and they sit at the top of the food chain. They require large amounts of energy in order to survive. Because little energy reaches that top, fewer apex predators can be supported. And this is why predator populations are smaller than prey populations. So, for example, there's far fewer wolves than there are deer, and there's far fewer hawks than there are mice. A lot of pollutants get released into the environment and just don't disappear. Instead, they can build up in organisms and move through those food webs we mentioned. They can become more harmful over time because of this. So, today we're going to talk about bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation occurs when an organism absorbs a toxin faster than it can eliminate it. These usually are very persistent toxins, meaning they don't break down easily. Many are fat soluble, so they're stored in fatty tissue rather than excreted. Over time, even small exposures can lead to dangerous concentrations in organisms. An example would be a fish living in a polluted water. They may absorb small amounts of mercury from its environment. Even if the water contains only trace amounts, the mercury will slowly build up in this fish's tissue over time. And I will tell you, this is happening in my area in Hillsborough County. I found the report recently, and unfortunately, there's still some people that are fishing out of the retention ponds where these events are happening. So it's always a good idea to know what's going on in the water source if you're fishing and consuming those fish from those areas. Biomagnification occurs when concentrations of toxins increase at higher trophic levels in a food chain or food web. So when that predator eats many contaminated prey, they also consume all the toxins stored in those organisms. Because energy and biomass decreases at higher trophic levels, toxins become more concentrated in those predators. And this makes those top predators especially vulnerable. So, for example, small fish contain low levels of mercury. Larger fish eat many smaller fish. A predator like a tuna or an eagle eats a lot of large fish, and the predators end up with a much higher toxin concentration. So, one example of these is DDT. And we saw this with bald eagles, where consumption of prey that contained DDT accumulated in the bald eagles. And when they laid their eggs, it caused shell thinning. So the shells would actually crack before the offspring could grow large enough to develop into viable bald eagles. So this led to a massive decline in bald eagle population, and eventually DDT was banned. And luckily today we're seeing less issues of it. However, they are seeing that a lot of it accumulated in whale fat. So some of the whales that are dying now and ending up on shores still contain parts of them. And there's a lot of monitoring of bird populations to ensure that those birds that are feeding off of the carcasses are not being affected by that. I mentioned before about mercury. This is another one that can build up and it can have a negative effect on the nervous system. And then we have PCBs, which are industrial chemicals, and they have been linked to cancer and hormone disruptions. And some of these, we're still trying to figure out what the exact pathways are. So there's definitely a lot of room for research there. So even if these contaminations are in low concentrations, they can be really harmful because they do accumulate in these species. They can include negative effects on reproductive behaviors, so reproductive failures. They can cause weakened immune systems and neurological damage and death. And the damage often appears at the top of the food web. And usually it's long after that pollution has been released. So apex predators are most affected because they eat a lot of different organisms over their lifespan. They sit at the top of the food web. They accumulate the highest toxin concentrations. Humans are also affected, particularly when consuming fish and seafood, and this is why seafood advisories exist. It's also why pregnant women and children are advised to limit consumptions of certain fish. Development of the brain is especially sensitive to toxins like mercury. A biome is a large geographical region defined by its climate, especially temperature and precipitation, and the types of plants and animals that live there. Because climate strongly controls what can survive in an area, each biome has a distinct ecosystem and species that's adapted to those conditions. Biomes are primarily shaped by two things: temperature, whether it's hot or cold, or seasonal variations, and precipitation, the amount and timing of rainfall. These can determine the dominant plant types, the soil characteristics, and the animals that can survive there. The first biome we're going to talk about are tropical rainforests. They're found near the equator and have warm temperatures and high rainfall year round. They have the highest biodiversity on Earth. Their soil is often nutrient poor because heavy rainfall washes those nutrients away. Nutrients are quickly recycled through living plants. One example of this is the Amazon rainforest. Despite that poor soil, dense plant growth supports millions of different species throughout these areas. Next, we have savannas, also called tropical grasslands. These are grass dominated biomes with scattered trees. They're found in warm regions with seasonal rainfall. Fires and grazing can help maintain those grasslands by preventing overgrowth. Plants and animals are adapted to droughts and fires. One example of this is the African savanna with grasses, acacia trees, and large herbivores. But here in Florida, we also have our savannas, or we call them sandhills, and these are dominated by longleaf pine. Next, we have subtropical deserts. Deserts receive very little precipitation, often less than 25 centimeters per year. They can experience extreme temperatures, both hot and cold. Plants and animals have water conserving adaptations. For example, plants might have thick cuticles, spines. Animals might have nocturnal behavior where they forage at night rather than during the day. An example of this is the Sonora Desert. Life here has survived by minimizing water loss over time. Next, we have temperate grasslands. These have moderate rainfall and seasonal temperature changes. They're dominated by grasses, but with fewer trees. Soil is usually very deep and fertile, and many of these have actually been converted to agricultural hotspots for this reason. An example of this is the Great Plains of North America. They are among the most productive for farming. So a lot of areas out in this region, you'll see miles and miles and miles of farming. Next is temperate forest. They have 4 distinct seasons and are dominated by deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the fall. So they may appear dead, but they're actually considered deciduous and go a little bit dormant during that time. They typically have a lot of leaf litter, which enriches the soil with nutrients, and the animals are adapted to those seasonal temperature changes. So an example of this is most of the area along the eastern United States. The next is one of my favorites, boreal forests, also called taigas. These forests are found at high latitudes and have long, cold winters. They're dominated by coniferous trees like pine, spruce, and birch. The needles on those trees reduce the water loss and allow the plants to withstand snow. Their growing seasons are also very short. Examples of these include most of Canada and Siberia, and this biome makes up the largest portion of the northern hemisphere. This image was taken in the Saguenay Fjord, which is located in the northern region of Quebec, where the St. Lawrence River starts to open out into the Atlantic. This area was really cool because I got to see an endangered population of beluga whales. But the birch trees that you see growing out of these rocks are very well adapted to that cold, and they look beautiful all year round. This particular time, the area was covered in snow, there was ice everywhere, and these birch trees were withstanding every possible thing that the climate threw at it. Finally, we have the Arctic tundra. The tundra is the coldest biome and has very low precipitation and is characterized by permafrost, permanently frozen ground. This has a very short growing season, and plants are usually small with low growing trees that can't survive in most conditions. So areas include the Arctic regions of Alaska and northern Canada. This image was taken in the northern part of Iceland, looking out into the Arctic Ocean. That area has a particular species of birch tree that can survive up there. There's very few birch forests left, and a lot of the area is dominated by very small plants and mosses that grow where there's volcanic activity. So heather is one of the plants that you typically find there, but most of that heather is not even native to the region, but you will find a lot of it growing there. There's also plants like crowberries that are up and about. There are specific crow species that live in those colder areas, and there's actually ravens that one of them flew up onto the Fajikil Glacier when we were there. Two of them actually flew up there. But there are some species that are very well adapted. They also have their own adapted species of mallard ducks that will fly into the little lakes and ponds around there. We got to see a few of those while we were in Iceland. We also have aquatic biomes, which cover about 75% of Earth's surface. Even though they seem endless and uniform, these areas are organized into different vertical zones, and each is defined by how much sunlight reaches the water. The first zone is the oceanic zone. It's basically the open ocean. It starts where the continental shelf ends. So once you leave those shallow coastal waters, you enter this big, vast, deep ocean. Life here has to deal with much fewer nutrients and huge distances to land. But many large fish and migratory species spend their lives in this zone. Below the oceanic zone, we have the photic zone, which is the sunlit upper layer of the water. It receives enough sunlight for photosynthesis to occur. And because of that, the photic zone is filled with primary producers like phytoplankton, which are these tiny little plant-like organisms that form the foundation of the aquatic food web. Below that is the aphotic zone. Light barely reaches this far, so photosynthesis can't happen. Organisms that live here rely on food drifting down from above. Sometimes we call this marine snow or detritus. And then there's some organisms that will hunt other deep sea organisms. Finally, the deepest region is the abyssal zone. This area receives no light at all. It's cold. It has extremely high pressure and has very low nutrients. Despite those harsh conditions, the abyssal zone still supports life, and it includes some very unusual and interesting species. Let's look at some aquatic biomes. First, intertidal zones. These are some of the most dynamic environments on the planet. This is the area between high tide and low tide. So it's constantly changing. Depending on the time of day, this zone may be completely underwater or completely exposed to air. Because of these frequent changes, organisms that live here have to be incredibly tough. They must withstand drying out completely. They have to deal with changes in temperature, being exposed to the sun and the wind, and they have to be able to withstand the strong physical force of the waves crashing in. Intertidal communities include crabs, sea stars, barnacles, and mussels. Many of these species cling tightly to rocks or burrows, or they'll kind of go into sand so they aren't washed away. The intertidal substrate can change from soft to sandy beaches to muddy flats or rocky coastlines, and each type creates a unique habitat with different kinds of life. Moving out from the intertidal area, we reach the neritic zone, which extends from the low tide mark to about 200 meters deep, or the depth of the continental shelf. This zone is extremely important ecologically and economically. Because sunlight can penetrate through the entire depth of the neritic zone, it's highly productive. Photosynthesis happens all over in this area, which means an abundance of phytoplankton, the base of the marine food web we talked about. With so much plant life available, animal life is also abundant. The neritic zone is home to shrimp, fish, zooplankton, and many of the species we rely on in global fisheries. This is why coastal areas are hotspots for marine biodiversity. They have sunlight, they have nutrients, and relatively shallow waters. Within the neritic zone in warm, shallow waters, we find coral reefs. Reefs are built by coral polyps, which are these small organisms that secrete calcium carbonate to form hard skeletons. Over long periods of time, these structures grow into massive reef systems that host over 4,000 species of fish, making them some of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the ocean. Corals have specialized relationships with symbiotic algae that live inside their tissue. These algae perform photosynthesis and provide a lot of energy to coral. Because of this relationship, reefs are really sensitive to changes in water temperature. When the water becomes too warm, the algae get a little irritated and they leave. This is a process known as coral bleaching. Without the algae, the coral don't have energy, they weaken, and sometimes die. This makes warming oceans a major threat to reef ecosystems. Next are estuaries, which are incredibly productive transition zones where freshwater meets saltwater. The mixture creates what we call brackish water, and it looks kind of dirty and a little bit muddy, but these areas are important nurseries for life. Many fish, crustaceans, and mollusks spend the early parts of their life cycle here because the waters tend to be calm and have a lot of protection and food. But life in these areas isn't always easy. The salinity changes constantly depending on the tides, rainfall, and seasonal patterns. Because of this, estuary organisms need specialized adaptations. Some plants, called halophytes, can tolerate saltwater. Many animals can switch between aerobic and anaerobic respiration if oxygen levels fluctuate. An example of an estuary close to home is Tampa Bay. It's one very large estuary formed by the meeting of three major rivers: the Hillsborough, Alafaya, and the Manatee River. And of course, in Florida, our estuaries have manatees. This photo was taken at the Tico Manatee Viewing Center in Apollo Beach. If you ever get a chance, it's a really nice area to go and visit. They have a nature trail that has an overlook. You can climb up that. They have a boardwalk where you can look at the manatees. They have an educational center with a gift shop. It usually opens around November 2nd. I forget when exactly it closes, but the manatees do come in the winter time. The power plant makes the water around there really warm, so they come in to thermoregulate. But it is a really cool experience if you get the chance. Finally, let's look at freshwater biomes, which include lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and wetlands. Even though freshwater makes up less than 1% of Earth's water, these habitats support a huge portion of the planet's biodiversity. Lakes and ponds are standing or still bodies of water. In these systems, phytoplankton are the primary producers and form the base of the food web. These ecosystems often experience stratification, meaning the layers of water have different temperatures and oxygen content. When excess nutrients enter these waters, usually in the form of fertilizer runoff, they can trigger algal blooms. When the algae die and decompose, oxygen levels drop, and this tends to kill a large portion of fish. Rivers and streams, on the other hand, are flowing systems. Their upper section, or headwaters, tend to be clear, cold, and have low nutrients. Organisms here are usually adapted to those fast currents. As rivers move downstream, they widen and slow down, allowing the sediments to settle, and these slower stretches support more biodiversity because of that. Finally, wetlands are areas where the soil remains saturated either permanently or seasonally. These can include marshes, swamps, bogs, mudflats, and salt marshes. They support biodiverse plants and animals and can act as natural water filters, flood buffers, or carbon sinks.